My name is Rachel. I'm 42 years old and I live alone now, quietly, and on my own terms. Most days begin with coffee on my little porch, watching the world pass by without asking anything from it. I didn't used to live like this. I used to wake up early to make breakfast for a man who said I didn't need to worry about money, who insisted that he had it all handled. The morning it all came undone, I had just poured myself a cup when my phone buzzed. It was an alert from the bank. Joint account, 0 balance. I looked up. He was leaning against the counter, sipping his own coffee like nothing happened. Then he smiled, almost pityingly, and said, "You'll figure it out, won't you?" I didn't ask why. I didn't yell. I just looked at him, turned around, and walked to the hallway closet. I reached up for the envelope I'd hidden 6 months ago. I had already started preparing for this. I met Daniel when I was 30. At the time, I was working long shifts as a marketing assistant at a mid-size firm, mostly unnoticed, mostly exhausted. He walked into my life like someone who already had everything figured out. There was a calm confidence to him, the kind that made people stop mid-sentence and shift their attention. He wasn't loud, not charming in the showy way, but he listened, and that made him feel different. We met at a mutual friend's barbecue. I remember I had grease on my hands from helping the host pull a tray out of the oven, and Daniel handed me a napkin before I even asked. "You're the first person who didn't pretend not to see me struggling," I'd said, half joking. He smiled and said, "I notice things." It started from there. We dated for a year. He was steady, generous, and consistent. He never missed a call, always made plans in advance, and never pressured me. I'd had relationships before that felt like storms, thrilling, chaotic, exhausting. Daniel was more like a harbor, safe, predictable. That predictability became seductive in its own way. He made me feel like I could rest for once. I didn't have to be so alert, so responsible all the time. After a year, he proposed over dinner, no spectacle, no kneeling, just a quiet question over wine. I said yes without hesitation. He suggested, "I quit my job after we married." "You've been working nonstop since college," he said. "Let me take care of you for once." At first, I hesitated. I wasn't raised to rely on anyone financially. My mother had a drawer full of just-in-case cash and always reminded me never to be left without an exit plan. But Daniel wasn't. My father. He wasn't controlling or cruel. He didn't raise his voice. He made it sound like a gift, not a trap. Eventually, I said yes. I resigned from my job and started doing freelance design here and there. Not much, just enough to keep my skills alive. I thought it would be temporary. It wasn't. In the first year of marriage, I handed over our household bills without much thought. It started small. He wanted to streamline things, avoid bill confusion, as he called it. He set up autopay for utilities, moved some accounts into his name for simplicity. He added me to a joint credit card and said it would be easier if everything flowed through one account. I believed him. By year 3, I realized I didn't know our bank passwords anymore. I had to ask him to transfer grocery money some weeks. I'd casually bring it up. "Hey, I can't log in again. Can you reset it?" And he'd brush it off. "It's just a glitch. I'll take care of it." He always said he'd take care of it. I started feeling uneasy, but it wasn't just the money. It was how easily he laughed when I asked questions. Once I brought up how the credit card balance seemed high, and he chuckled. "That's why I handle this stuff. You worry too much." Then he kissed my forehead like I was a child. I should have pushed harder, but I didn't want to be the nagging wife. That's how I felt whenever I tried to assert myself, like I was disrupting some delicate balance, like I was being difficult. Over time, I noticed the patterns. Anytime I mentioned wanting to start consulting again, he'd subtly redirect the conversation. "You don't need to work right now. Enjoy this freedom. You've earned it. It always sounded like love, even though it wasn't really about me. Eventually, I stopped bringing it up. He started traveling more for work. I didn't know much about what he did. Something in finance. He explained it once, but it sounded like jargon. What I knew was that he wore expensive suits, carried 2 phones, and always kept one locked. My name wasn't on our home title. I found that out when I asked if we could refinance the mortgage to lower the monthly payments. That's just how we filed the paperwork, he said. It doesn't matter. We're married. What's mine is yours. Except that wasn't true. I began to feel like a guest in my own home, like everything I touched, every light switch, every drawer was borrowed. Nothing was in my name. I didn't even have a key to the home office anymore. The turning point wasn't dramatic. There wasn't one blow-up fight or loud accusation. It was a Tuesday morning. I needed to order some medication online, and our joint debit card got declined. I called the bank and learned the account had been emptied and closed 2 days prior. When I confronted him that evening, he smiled. Not cruelly, just like it didn't matter. I moved things around, he said, without explanation. It's fine. It wasn't fine. That night, while he showered, I pulled out an old laptop from the closet. One I'd kept from my freelance days. I started a spreadsheet. Then I started emailing myself screenshots of bank statements, bills, and transactions I could find. I opened a new savings account under my maiden name and transferred what little I'd earned from recent freelance gigs. I wasn't planning revenge. I just needed to remember who I was, that I still had a spine, that I wasn't asleep. For 6 months, I quietly collected records. I started printing copies and hiding them in the back of my recipe binder, between pages he'd never flipped through. Every time he laughed at one of my questions or dismissed me with a kiss, I added another file. It wasn't about catching him. It was about not losing myself. And as I stood in the kitchen that morning, phone in hand, staring at the zero balance, alert, I knew I was already halfway out. The betrayal stung, but the shock was long gone. It started like any other morning. I was washing fruit at the kitchen sink while the sunlight crept slowly over the tiles. The kettle had just clicked off. I remember this because I had my phone in one hand and a sliced pear in the other when the second notification buzzed. Withdrawal. $7,200. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe some auto-pay we'd forgotten to cancel. But then, just seconds later, another alert came through. Account balance, 041. My stomach didn't drop, not yet. It was more like a stillness, like the sound had gone out of the room. Daniel was sitting at the dining table. His laptop was open, but he wasn't typing. He was just sipping his coffee, slowly, staring into space like it was any other Thursday. I looked over at him. My voice came out steady. Did you transfer something out of our account? He didn't look at me at first. He smiled at the mug like it had said something clever. Yeah, he said, as casually as if I'd asked about the weather. Moved. Some stuff around. That's all the money we had in there, Daniel. He finally glanced up like I was pointing out a minor inconvenience. It's fine. I'll move some back later. Relax. But I wasn't panicking. I wasn't even confused. I was realizing. I walked over to the drawer where we kept the mail and pulled out our most recent bank statement. I had started saving them again, quietly, ever since he started rerouting the paperless settings. The last one showed $23,000. That was everything we had budgeted for the next 3 months. Groceries, mortgage, car insurance, and my small medical bill. Where did it go? I asked again, quieter now. He put his mug down and gave me a look I hadn't seen before. Not angry, not annoyed, just dismissive. It's mine, Rachel. I earned it. You just played house. I felt the words move through me like wind through a hallway. Empty. Cold. I stepped away and went into the bedroom. My laptop was still in the drawer, buried under an old quilt I hadn't used since winter. I sat on the floor and logged into our retirement account. 0. I checked my personal savings, the one I'd started years ago before I married him. Closed. Then I checked the credit card under my name, the one he once insisted I keep, just in case. Maxed. Thousands of dollars. In new charges. I didn't even recognize the vendors. I walked back into the kitchen and leaned against the counter. He looked at me again, this time with something that felt close to amusement. "What are you going to do?" he said, sipping again. "Call the cops. Tell them your husband moved money in his own house?" That's when I realized he wasn't bluffing. He wasn't scared. He didn't think he'd done anything wrong. In his mind, this was just redistribution. A man protecting what was his. I didn't respond. There was no point. We had no kids, no shared business. No family members would intervene. No witnesses. But I did have something. Something I never told him about. Something I had tucked away, not out of mistrust, but out of a quiet instinct that had always lived in me, even in the happiest moments. I stepped into the hallway and opened the utility closet. There, behind a stack of dusty baking trays, was an envelope. Thick, marked only with my maiden initials. Inside, photocopies of our joint accounts from the last 6 months, flagged emails where he transferred money to an unregistered LLC, and a USB drive. He thought I was slow. He thought I didn't notice, but I'd been paying attention, just not in the way he expected. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't ask for the money back. I grabbed my keys, wallet, and the envelope, and walked out the door. My hands were steady as I sat in my car. The sun had shifted fully above the trees now, casting long shadows down the driveway. I rolled the window down, breathed in. Then I took out a piece of paper I'd kept folded in my wallet for over a year. A name, a number, Marla Jensen, forensic accountant. I'd met her at a nonprofit workshop on financial literacy for women. I remembered her because she spoke slowly and didn't flinch when someone asked how to hide money from an abusive spouse. She didn't moralize. She just said, "Let's talk about documentation." I dialed her number. It rang twice. Then a calm voice answered, "This is Marla." I hesitated just a second. Then I said, "You probably don't remember me, but I think I need your help now." As I sat in my car that day, the line with Marla still echoing in my ear, I felt something stir deeper than anger. It wasn't even grief, not anymore. It was something older, something I hadn't thought about in years. There's a kind of betrayal that doesn't come with shouting or slamming doors, the kind that doesn't bruise your skin but still leaves a mark. The first time I ever felt that kind of abandonment, I was 24. Fresh out of grad school, working 2 part-time jobs, and still trying to convince myself that I was building something. I had just found out that the guy I'd been living with for over a year had drained our shared account, what little of it there was, and taken off to California to find himself. Rent was due in 5 days. My car had a cracked radiator. I had $38 to my name. I did what most people do when they're young and terrified. I called my father. He answered on the second ring. His voice that same dry tone he always used when he was watching the evening news. I didn't even get halfway through the story before he interrupted me. "Rachel," he said, with that sigh that somehow managed to carry disappointment before I'd done anything wrong. "You made your bed." That was it. No offer to help. No questions about whether I was okay. Just that one line. "You made your bed." I hung up and sat on the floor of my tiny studio apartment for what felt like hours. There were no tears, just stillness. It wasn't the first time I'd felt like I had to solve everything alone. As a child, I'd always been the one who smoothed things over. My parents didn't fight loudly, but they walled each other off in silence. When my younger brother would lash out or break something, it was me they looked to. Me who was told to be the bigger person, keep the peace, understand he's going through a phase. That phrase, keep the peace, it clung to me like a second skin. I learned early that speaking up caused friction, that being quiet meant people praised you, that if you didn't ask for much, maybe you'd be rewarded later. But there's a cost to being the peacemaker. You start believing that your comfort comes second, that your voice is optional. That endurance is the same as loving. That memory of my father's indifference kept me company that entire week. I pawned a bracelet my grandmother had given me, picked up extra shifts, ate oatmeal for 5 days straight. I survived. Barely. But something changed in me after that. I didn't tell anyone, not even close friends, but I opened a new bank account under my maiden name, quietly, just in case. I started doing small freelance projects, editing resumes, designing flyers, helping people with LinkedIn profiles. I didn't advertise it. I didn't even list it publicly. But slowly, over months, it added up. By the time I met Daniel, that account had just over $2,000. By the time we got married, it was nearly $5,000. It wasn't much, but it was something that was mine. A sliver of control in a life where I often handed it away too easily. I remember one night during our second year of marriage, Daniel had just come home from a business trip. He was tired, distracted, barely listening. I had spent all day fixing a problem with a bill that had been double charged to one of our accounts. When I mentioned it over dinner, trying to make conversation, he waved it off. "That's why I don't want you stressing about money stuff," he said. "It's not your thing." Not your thing. It was like hearing, "You made your bed all over again, just dressed in a different suit." I didn't argue. I never did. But that night, after he fell asleep, I got out of bed and opened my laptop. I filed a DBA for consulting services under my maiden name. I used the address of a friend's home office and listed myself as the only employee. I registered for a separate PayPal and Stripe account. Every invoice I sent had my initials and nothing more. It was the first time I had ever actively hidden something from him. And it wasn't malicious. It was protective. He never knew. That small account eventually became my lifeline. The income wasn't huge, but it was steady. And over time, I learned how to move in silence. I bought a prepaid phone to take client calls. I kept printed invoices hidden in an old recipe binder, behind laminated pages I knew he'd never look at. It wasn't that I planned for this outcome. I never sat there and imagined I'd need to escape, but I knew what it felt like to be left empty-handed. I knew what it felt like to dial a number, hoping for rescue, and be met with silence. So I built my own life in the margins of the one I shared with him. And the strangest part? He never noticed. Or maybe he did. Maybe he just didn't care. Or maybe he believed so completely in his control that he thought I couldn't possibly think 2 steps ahead. That memory of being told, "You made your bed," was no longer a wound. It had become a lesson, one I carried with me into every quiet act of independence. As I sat in that car, holding the envelope full of documents, I realized I hadn't just played along all these years. I had been preparing. He thought I was quiet because I didn't notice. He didn't realize I was quiet because I was remembering. And now I wasn't waiting for anyone to save me. I was saving myself. The days that followed moved with an eerie stillness. I stayed with a friend for the first few nights, someone I trusted, someone who didn't ask too many questions. She let me be quiet. She offered coffee in the mornings and left a blanket folded neatly at the edge of the couch each evening. It was the kind of grace I didn't know I needed until I had it. My hands stayed busy. That helped. I organized every piece of paper I'd hidden over the past year. Receipts, printed emails, flagged bank statements, photos of checks made out to fake consulting companies that I now knew were shells. I created a spreadsheet. Dates, amounts, transaction IDs. It felt like piecing together a language I'd forgotten I spoke. Numbers and proof. Silence and precision. A week later, I called Marla back. She remembered me. We met at a coffee shop off the main road, neutral territory. She came in wearing a simple blazer and soft-soled shoes, carrying a laptop bag that looked older than mine. She didn't speak in dramatic tones or offer sympathy. She listened. Carefully. She asked clear, focused questions. And when I laid out the documents on the table between us, she just nodded slowly. "I've seen this before," she said. "You did the hard part already." "What do you mean?" I asked. "You didn't wait until it was all gone," she replied. "You documented. You kept your own records. You noticed patterns. That's rare. We spent 2 hours together. By the end of it, she'd offered to connect me with a legal contact. Someone she trusted. A woman named Leela, who specialized in financial coercion and asset tracing. No drama. No press. Just facts and strategy. That was the first night I slept through without waking up. The following Monday, I met with Lila in her office downtown. The space was small but quiet, filled with plants and soft, worn books. She had a way of speaking that didn't invite pity, only presence. When I told her what Daniel had done, the transfers, the hidden accounts, the manipulation, she didn't blink. "Do you have reason to believe he committed fraud across state lines?" she asked. "Yes." "And do you have copies of all the transactions and how they were moved?" "Yes." She nodded. "Then you're not filing for divorce right now. You're filing a report." The next few weeks were a rhythm I hadn't known before. Equal parts emotion and execution. Every evening, I reviewed documents with Marla and Lila. We built a timeline. We traced every dollar he'd moved, some to offshore accounts, others funneled through shell companies under names I didn't recognize, but Marla did. One belonged to a man recently arrested for securities fraud. Another was linked to a company under investigation for laundering cryptocurrency. Daniel had always been careful, arrogant, but not stupid. He moved just enough to keep things under the radar. But over the years, those small shifts had added up to something substantial. I wasn't just his wife anymore. I was a witness. Lila handled the legal coordination with the Financial Crimes Division. She told me to say very little and document everything. Don't speak to him. Don't return to the house. Don't log into any shared accounts. I followed her instructions like the gospel. Daniel called me 6 times during those weeks. I never answered. The voicemails ranged from casual, "We should talk," to irritated, "You're being dramatic," to defensive, "You're really going to turn this into a thing?" I forwarded each one to Lila. He didn't realize how quiet justice works. It builds slowly, behind closed doors, in spreadsheets and quiet meetings, while the accused walks around, still smug, still thinking he's untouchable. Then one Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after my first meeting with Lila, she called me. "They're ready." That was all she said. I parked a block away from the house that morning, my old spot, under the oak tree. I didn't want to be seen, not really. I just wanted to be present. The house looked the same. Pale blue siding. The garden I once kept tidy is now slightly overgrown. The porch still had the wind chime he bought on our honeymoon. I'd always found the sound soothing. Now it felt like a stranger's ringtone. At exactly 10:14 a.m., a black sedan pulled into the driveway. 2 men in plain clothes stepped out. One held a folder. The other had a badge clipped to his belt. I watched from the car as they approached the door. Daniel answered, wearing joggers and a casual button-down, like he hadn't changed since the morning I left. He looked surprised, then amused. He gestured at them to come in, but they didn't move. The taller agent handed him a document. Daniel started reading, then looked up, confused. "This is a mistake," I could almost hear him say. The shorter agent calmly replied, "This is not a joke, sir." Daniel's face shifted. Not fear, not guilt, just confusion. Like he truly hadn't expected the world to treat his actions as real. He tried to argue, pointed to something in the document. The agent simply pointed toward the car and placed a firm hand on Daniel's arm. A few moments later, Daniel was led to the sedan. No handcuffs, just firm steps and silence. He didn't look back, and I didn't smile. I just sat there, breathing. My fingers resting lightly on the steering wheel. There were no cheers. No victory music. Just the wind moving through the trees and the low rumble of the car engine as it pulled away. I waited a few minutes. Then I stepped out of the car and walked slowly toward the mailbox. I hadn't planned to do it, but I found myself unlocking it one last time. Inside were two things: a credit card offer in both our names, and a plain envelope addressed only to him. I slid both back inside, closed the box, locked it, and walked away. There wasn't a trial. No headline. No dramatic court appearance or press release. It was quieter than people imagined. There were interviews, of course, statements, affidavits, and digital forensics. But in the end, Daniel took a deal. White-collar cases don't often play out the way crime shows suggest. He didn't fight. He didn't apologize either. He just signed what needed to be signed. The government froze several of his accounts. The shell companies were dismantled, and investigators uncovered even more than I'd found. Offshore transfers, cryptocurrency laundering, falsified payroll structures. He forfeited assets. A portion of them, at least, were returned to joint, marital property. Lila, my attorney, handled it all. When she called to say the funds had cleared, she didn't congratulate me. She just said, "It's done. You're free to start over." I remember nodding, even though she couldn't see me. I whispered a thank you and hung up. I didn't cry. I just sat with the finality of it. I used part of the recovered money to pay off lingering debts, mostly medical and legal, and put the rest into a new account, in my name only. No joint access, no invisible strings. The apartment I moved into was nothing like the house I left behind. It was smaller, older, a little creaky in the floorboards. But it was mine. I chose every object carefully. No heavy furniture, no expensive decor. Just things that made me feel grounded. A secondhand armchair, a little ceramic lamp from a flea market, and a bookshelf I built myself over a weekend with trembling hands and quiet pride. The balcony was my favorite part. It overlooked a small city park, just a patch of green and a few benches, but it gave me the feeling of space, of not being boxed in anymore. For the first few weeks, I barely spoke, not because I was sad, but because I didn't need to explain anything. Silence became a comfort, not a punishment. I spent my mornings with tea and a journal, writing short reflections, not about him, not anymore, about myself, who I'd been. Who was I now? What I'd learned. I stopped checking Daniel's name online. I stopped asking people if they'd heard anything. Whatever consequences he faced were his to carry. I was done holding that weight. What surprised me most was how quickly peace replaced fear. There had been so much fear, so much calculation, restraint, pretending, for years. I thought it would linger, but it didn't. It dissolved quietly, like morning mist when the sun rises. I joined a women's group about 2 months after the case closed. It wasn't a support group, exactly more like a space, part legal resource, part quiet community. Most of us had left some form of control, financial, emotional, or both. Some had children, others didn't. Some had lost more than I had. Some were still clawing their way toward clarity. We didn't spend much time retelling our stories. We focused on the after, the now, the next steps, budgeting, legal rights, how to talk to a bank manager, how to trust again. After a while, I started helping new members, not as a counselor, just as someone who'd been there. I sat beside women who spoke with shaking voices, who had just opened their first solo accounts, who didn't know how to check their credit scores. I told them what Marla told me. You did the hard part already. You noticed. You documented. You endured. Sometimes that's all a person needs, to be reminded they're not invisible. A few weeks ago, I met a woman named Clara, mid-30s, kind eyes, and a stack of notebooks in her bag, filled with records. She wasn't sure what to do with them. I recognized the same tremor in her voice I used to hear in my own. We sat down together. I didn't offer advice at first. I just said, "I believe you." She started crying, not loudly, not uncontrollably. Just that quiet release, the kind that feels like an exhale after years of holding your breath. That moment reminded me why I'd survived. Not for revenge, not even for freedom, but for connection, for clarity. To one day turn to someone and say, "You're not alone," and mean it. This morning was like many others now. I woke early, made tea with honey, stepped out onto my little balcony as the sky turned gold. A jogger passed below. A child on a scooter wobbled past a woman reading on a bench. The world felt manageable. Even beautiful. I sat down in the chair I'd rescued from a thrift store and pulled a light blanket over my knees. I opened the banking app on my phone, not out of fear, but habit. And there it was, an alert. Deposit received, $1,600. Client, C. Mason Consulting. I paused, then smiled to myself. The account is in my name now, fully, permanently. No one else's fingerprints. No oversight. No permission required. I locked the screen, set the phone down, picked up my tea, and just sat for a while, watching the light shift. Through the leaves, listening to the faint rustle of the world continuing on. Not as something happening to me, but something I belonged to again.